In this first section for Related Issue 1, we discuss such important concepts as identity and nation, and we saw what they meant, identity being those key features that individuals use to describe themselves, and nation is basically a set of understandings that individuals have that allow them to have a sense of belonging to a group. Let's now consider again the related issue: to what extent should nation be the foundation of identity? And in order to understand this, we need to understand one more important concept. And so by the end of this lesson, you should be able to define this important concept, which is the concept of nationalism. Also, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to give examples of nationalistic symbols. And so let's begin this last lesson for the first section. Have you ever heard of a place called Calabria? Well, you probably haven't, but whether you have or you haven't, Calabria is a province of Italy, and it's located in the extreme south part of the Italy. In fact, it is basically the toe of the boot of Italy. Here's a picture of Calabria. It obviously is a part of the Italian country that is along the sea. It's along the Ionian Sea, and so obviously swimming and boating are important parts of activities that people in Calabria take part in. But how about some other symbols, perhaps nationalistic symbols of Calabria? Well, here's an actual official symbol of the province of Calabria, or the region of Calabria. Here is a picture of people in their traditional attire, and so that would also be an important element of their national identity. And of course, an important cathedral. I believe this cathedral is in one of the cities, whether it's Reggio Calabria, Cosenza, I'm not sure, but the Catholic Church is symbolized by this cathedral as an important part of the identity of Calabria. The ancient monuments that exist in Calabria, there were many ancient Greek city-states in Calabria, and so those ancient relics of a previous civilization also make important elements and symbols of the identity of Calabria. How about other symbols? Well, we looked at symbols of Calabria. Let's now take a look at some symbols of a sports team. How about the Montreal Canadiens? Let's look at some of their symbols. You may ask why the Canadiens, but you'll get a better understanding here in a moment as to why we're going to use some symbols for this team. Well, here's an important symbol of the Montreal Canadiens. It's actually the logo of the team, and it provides an important symbol for the franchise. Here's an old picture of one of the greatest stars of the Montreal Canadiens, Rocket Richard. In fact, there is a trophy, the trophy for the person who scores the most goal in one season, the Rocket Richard trophy. Here's another picture of Rocket Richard. He was known as a very intense individual, especially when he had a chance at scoring a goal. And here is a picture of what's arguably the greatest team in the history of hockey, of the NHL at least, the 1955-56 Montreal Canadiens. And here is a picture of some of their great stars. Here's another picture of Rocket Richard, who is being restrained as he's attempting to get into a fight with a member from another team. Now, why would I be showing you these pictures, particularly when we're considering the idea of nationalism, and we just looked at some nationalistic symbols of the province of Calabria, one of the states or provinces of Italy? Well, let's look at these symbols again from the Montreal Canadiens in a bit of a different context. Let's look at it within the context of Quebec. Quebec, like Calabria, is a province. Quebec is a province of Canada, whereas Calabria is a province of Italy. And like Calabria, Quebec has some important nationalistic symbols. And the Montreal Canadiens, the logo, is one of the important symbols of the Quebecois, the Quebec people, and of the province of Quebec. The Montreal Canadiens, the most storied franchise in the National Hockey League, forms an important part of the national identity of the Quebecois, and it's an important part of its history. Rocket Richard, one of the greatest players of all time, was a French-Canadian player, and he is a great symbol of the French Canadian people, and he's an icon to the Quebecois. Here's another picture. This is actually a picture of the Montreal Forum, and this is where a riot had taken place when Montreal was forced to suspend the Rocket Richard for the entire playoffs because of an incident that he was involved in. And then the first home game following his suspension led to a riot in which the game that the Montreal Canadiens were playing was forfeited to their opponents, the Detroit Red Wings. And this picture, this riot, became an important element in the history of Quebec, an important part of its national development and the idea, their sense of nationhood that the Quebecois have developed. And part of that has come from the fact that incidences like the Great Riot in Montreal took place in relation to the Montreal Canadiens, and it did, as I mentioned, form an important part of their national identity. Here's another picture. This is an actual picture of a fan, a French-Canadian fan, trying to assault the president of the National Hockey League at the time, Clarence Campbell, who had suspended the Rocket. And this is part of the riot that had taken place. And again, it formed an important part of the sense of nation that developed in Quebec, particularly in the 1950s and then later on. This riot then spread throughout the city, with chaos taking place in the city of Montreal. A great deal of destruction took place in downtown Montreal, with a great deal of looting. Fires had broken out, and so this whole sense of riot was one of the awakenings that the French-Canadian people saw, and a sense of nation being built. And here is a picture of the Rocket actually going on the radio asking for fans of the Montreal Canadiens, the French-Canadian people in Montreal, to cease their rioting and to go back home. And this, along with the riot itself and even the logo of the Montreal Canadiens and the Rocket himself, became an important part, an important nationalistic symbol for the people of Quebec. And even though the people of Quebec are part of and citizens of the country of Canada, they see themselves as a unique nation, a French-speaking nation, and so all of these symbols, which had been previously shown as simply symbols of a sports team, are important nationalistic symbols for the people of Quebec. So again, we talked about the logo of the Montreal Canadiens and how important it is to the Quebec people. Here's another logo. Here's another important symbol, and this is the fleur-de-lis, the flag of the province of Quebec, but it holds national sentiment and nationalistic feelings for the people of Quebec as they see themselves as a nation unto themselves. Here we have I believe it's the Citadel in Quebec City, which is seen as a sense of independence and the identity of the Quebecois, as it was an important part of the city of Quebec, which was at one time an independent part of a colony of France that fell to the English. Here we see another important symbol, the Parti Québécois with its leader. The Parti Québécois are now in power again. They're a separatist party, and they have tried on 2 occasions to have Quebec separate from the rest of Canada. And currently the Parti Québécois, are the governing party for the province of Quebec. And one wonders if they will try and hold another referendum to see if they can actually gain independence for Quebec. So what is nationalism then? Well, let's use these symbols and these incidences that we talked about to give an idea of what nationalism is. Notice the difference between Calabria and Quebec. Calabria is a province in Italy, and Quebec is a province in Canada. But there's another notable difference, and that is the fact that the Calabrese people may see themselves as a regional people, but they see themselves as Italians, whereas the Quebecois see themselves as Quebecois, an independent nation within a nation. And so those various symbols that we used, particularly as relates to the Montreal Canadiens, these were important symbols that helped develop the idea of nation for the Quebecois people. And so it's the essence of nationalism, which is a sense of creating an independent nation from an ethnic group. And so the feelings that people have, those that they use and have in identifying with a nation, is basically the sense of nationalism. But nationalism, as I mentioned, just a few moments ago also refers to the process or a movement of a group of people creating or uniting to form an independent nation. And Quebec is an example of this in that over time the Quebecois see themselves as a nation unto themselves. They identify as a specific nation, and there has been a concerted effort by a number of people within Quebec to form an independent nation. And so in many ways, Quebec nationalism best exemplifies the meaning of the term itself. And as I had mentioned, the Quebecois do in fact see themselves as a people, and they identify as a nation within nations. Now, the question becomes, will they create an independent state? That is the question. In the first referendum that was held in 1976, I believe that the vote broke down 60% to remain in Canada and 40% to separate. But in the mid-1990s, with the second referendum, the difference between remaining in Canada and separating was less than 1%. And so should there be a third referendum, will Quebec actually form an independent nation? And if they should do so, they would certainly, in doing so, manifest the idea of nationalism. So nationalism, as we'd mentioned, is that movement, that process of creating an independent nation from a group of people that have a sense of belonging to a particular ethnicity. It's also a phenomenon that refers to having pride in a particular country or group, and the Quebecois would certainly be an example of this. Having a flag, a national anthem, or other symbols also is an example of and important elements of nationalism, and they result from nationalism. And certainly, should Quebec become independent, all of those items we talked about, from the logo of the Montreal Canadiens, to the riots, to the flags, to the citadel, and so on and so forth, would become important symbols of an independent Quebec. And so we see basically what nationalism is. Again, it is a sense of pride that an individual or group has in a nation, and it's also the process or movement of a group of people who share common values based on ethnicity or some other common element, and a desire to form an independent nation. We see the process and the attempts of Quebec on two occasions with two different referendums to separate and form an independent nation as a good example of this. Hopefully, from our perspective, Quebec remains within Canada and sees itself as a nation within a nation, but whatever happens in the future, what we can understand from the standpoint of Quebec as an example, that nationalism definitely is a process and one in which a people strive to gain independence.